Hello, Buckeye fans. What's going on? I'm Patrick Murphy, and welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. We are going to talk post-spring today, and I want to examine the storylines that, at least I feel, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but the storylines that I feel haven't been talked about enough. The just need more discussion. And I have a list of them that we'll go through. If you have ideas, please feel free. If there are things that you thought didn't get talked about enough coming out of Ohio State's spring practice, please let us know. And as always, if you're watching this on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube page, turn on those alerts to know when we post on YouTube. We post all of our videos from interviews, all of the podcasts, all the things we do. So it's a great way to easily get your Buckeye coverage if you like that avenue. If you're listening to this as a podcast, Facebook, on Twitter, all that, please like, subscribe, 5-star review. All of those things are very helpful. We do appreciate it. If you are in the live chat, and I'll remind you this throughout, please comment questions that you have about the Buckeyes, about college football, whatever. Feel free to throw those in there. We should have time at the end to get to a lot of those. I love talking with you guys on this show, not just talking to myself. So if you have questions, if you have comments, like I said, if you think there are things that I don't mention that haven't been talked about enough since spring practice ended just a week ago, throw those in there as well. Whatever you guys want to talk about that is at least on topic, keep it somewhat relevant. Let's do that. We'll get to those throughout and definitely at the end if there are questions/comments. And then before we get going, we're going with a Bud Light today. I had a couple of these bottles in the refrigerator. I'm not sure. I don't remember where they came from. I also was in St. Louis visiting some family last week. That's where I'm originally from. Bud Light, also originally from St. Louis. So felt like it was a timely beer to drink. So cheers. All right, let's get into it. So some of these stories, they've definitely been talked about. I don't think you go through a spring practice with the way Ohio State is covered with so many different outlets and news stations and all that stuff. And there's not much that slips through the cracks. But these are some things that I think, probably deserve some more discussion coming out of spring. And we're going to start on the defensive side of the ball with what I think, and I think a lot of people would agree, is a group of dominant linebackers that are going to be about as good as you're going to find, I think, assuming they live up to the potential. And Sonny Styles, obviously, what he did last year for the Buckeyes, was the second on the team in tackles. I think he ended up with 100 through the playoff run behind Cody Simon. The need to replace Cody Simon was alleviated quite a bit by the play of Arvell Reese last season, a guy that can step in and play. It's very different than Cody Simon, but certainly a candidate to step in at that middle linebacker position. I don't think there's questions about who's going to replace Cody Simon. So those two, for a group of starting linebackers, whether you have talent or whether you have 3 linebackers, 4 linebackers, 2 linebackers, however a team sets up, I don't know if you're going to find a much better starting group than Arvell Reese, who still has to prove it. Let's be clear. He had some good moments last year, but he has to prove he can be a starter. But the physical traits, the ability that we've seen already, I think has been on display. And so you feel confident about that. And then obviously Sonny Styles had his struggles a bit to start last year, moving from safety down to linebacker, but really I thought improved by the end of the season, was playing really well. So you've got those two at the heart of your defense. And then behind them, you've got some depth there that I think is pretty interesting. And look, You obviously hope you don't need that. I don't know if Ohio State will play with more 3 linebackers, whether that be actually on the field together or rotation. But I will say, and if you've listened to Dave Biddle talk, you've probably already heard about this, but Peyton Pierce is somebody that I think can certainly work his way into a rotational role similar to what Arvell Reese did last year, jumping up, stepping in when needed. Maybe he has to play a bigger role at some point in time. Maybe they go to 3 linebackers in some game and Peyton Pierce is in there. But the sophomore from Texas, James Laurinaitis, talked glowingly about him when we spoke with him, which is never a bad thing to have when your position coach is talking about you in a positive manner. But even beyond that group, just kind of reading through the list of linebackers. So you've got Sonny and Arvell. You've then got that Peyton Pierce, who I think is that third guy, Garrett Stover, Riley Pettijohn, the freshman, TJ Alford, a freshman, Eli Lee, a freshman. So a pretty talented group there. And then you've even got guys like Joey Velasquez as a walk-on guy who has actually played for the last 2 national champions, played with Michigan, played with Ohio State last year. Eli Riggs, another one. So that's a pretty talented group. They brought in Ty Howard, who the brother of running back Bo Jackson. Ty Howard coming from the transfer portal. So I think this is a group that has a chance to be really dominant in 2025. I think the starting group is exciting, but then just the depth that Ohio State has. And, obviously we need to see some of these guys prove themselves and whatnot. But I think that it's another talented group of linebackers that James Laurinaitis has assembled. And I just don't know if we've talked about it enough. I know Sonny Styles got some pub early, with the could he be the Blocko? Cody Simon talking about him as a Blocko player. But, it's just there wasn't a lot of news from that linebacker room because you have Sonny Styles coming back. You have a guy like Arvell Reese ready to step in. So I think we've just kind of allowed that to be a quiet position this offseason, but one that certainly can be a major impact and should not be quiet come next fall. The next one I had was the offensive line coming together. And I think the concern early in the spring, maybe even before spring practice began, was there about the offensive line. I feel like that seems to be a trend with Ohio State, right? Off seasons, concerned about offensive line. Cheers. So I think that was a story that was certainly well covered. But then as spring went on, you kind of heard it quiet down, or you didn't hear anything much about the offensive line. And I think that's a good thing because guys started to settle into positions. And that's not to say that this can't change. And there's a good chance that it will before the start of the season, or at least there's an opportunity for that. But I think that we've probably not talked about how this group has come together. And by that, I mean mainly with the tackle positions. If you paid attention to the starting group in the spring game, it was as expected with transfer from Rice, Ethan Onianwa at left tackle, and Austin Sareveld at right tackle. Austin Sareveld, who last season was playing both guard positions, sometimes in the same game. So not a guy that I think a lot of people expected going into spring to be a starting right tackle, but a guy who showed that he can do that during the spring. And then obviously the interior, you had the returners of Luke Montgomery at left guard, Carson Hinsman at center, and Tegra Shabola at right guard. So that's a pretty good starting group, right? And then the Buckeyes spent spring with guys having multiple positions. So they were kind of cross-training at different positions to make sure that they are prepared in case something like last season happens. And, you found some depth, I think, in there. A guy like Ian Moore, who was at the beginning of spring lining up with the first team offensive line at left tackle. You've obviously got depth on the interior. You can move pieces around. Phillip Daniels, the other transfer who could play right tackle, probably needs some more time to develop, but could certainly push for that spot We talked about Austin Sareveld and his flexibility. Josh Padilla could come in at center. Carson Hinsman can move around to guard if needed. So I think coming out of spring practice, this group has really made progress in terms of the way you are thinking about. If you were listing Ohio State's biggest concerns coming out of spring practice, I think offensive line would have dropped from the start of spring practice quite a bit. Now they still need to continue. I think obviously, Onyanwa needs to continue to develop to be ready. Week 1 against Texas. Same thing with Austin Sareveld at right tackle to make sure that that's the right guy for that position. I think the guys that are behind need to keep pushing. I don't think there is anything wrong with more competition at that spot. And so just because you didn't come out of spring as, potentially a first team offensive lineman doesn't mean that you couldn't work your way into that. But I feel much more confident about that group than I did going into the spring and probably even thought that I would coming out of the spring, even knowing they had some guys that could make some strides. And I think that, that's going to be huge, especially when you're talking about new starting quarterback, new group of running backs. Even your tight ends are going to look a little different. So having an offensive line that at least right now seems pretty settled, and you seem like you're okay with this group, more than okay, I would say, if you're Ohio State. I think that's a pretty big deal and probably something we should be discussing even more. Cheers. If you joined us late, if you're watching this live, I mentioned off the top, but please jump in the comments, questions, things like that. I think make for a better show. We'll get to a lot of those as we go. Probably most of them at the end. I did see a couple that were relevant for here. Hold on just a second. Let me find them. Emily asks, Cook making noise. Jake Cook, the freshman. Yeah, I thought he did some good things from what we saw from him during spring. I think that is it's a young guy at a position that requires a lot of development, right? You rarely see freshmen come in and play right away, but I think it was a good start for him early on spring practice, getting adjusted, all that. If you have questions, again, throw those in there. Craig Bowman said O-line U this year, lots of experience and talent. Yeah, it's definitely different than in past off seasons, I think, with this group. So something to be excited about if you're Ohio State. Not that you need that with this team and what they just came off of. The next thing is, and I understand why this has not been a major topic of conversation, but is this the deepest tight end room Ohio State has had? Is this the deepest tight end room in the country? I think the case could be made for both of those things. You look at this group, returning from last year, you've got Will Kazmarek, Bennett Christensen, Jelani Thurman, and Max LeBlanc, who all played a good amount. Max LeBlanc, not a ton, but the rest of those guys, and Max LeBlanc did play a good amount last season. Even all of them played in the college football playoff. So right there, you have a good returning group. There's different body types, different types of players. You bring in Nate Roberts this spring as well. It's a nice group. Then you go out in the transfer portal and you add Max Clare, the tight end from Purdue, one of the top tight ends in the country a year ago from a receiving perspective. And I mean, this is a really interesting tight end room that Keenan Bailey has assembled. I think if you look at it at Ohio State's offense and you think, okay, who's going to get the ball the most? The wide receivers, the running backs, that's going to be how it goes. That's how it's gone in the past. But with this group, I think you saw it a little bit in the spring game, both Max Clare and Nate Roberts had some big catches. Like for me, these guys, Jelani Thurman, certainly you saw him make some plays last year. Like there is opportunity here. I mean, Will Kazmarek, if he can stay healthy, that catch against Oregon that he made that he ended up getting hurt on, what was really, really an impressive play. And he's only continuing to develop. Bennett Christensen, the same thing. From a receiving perspective, I think this is a group that could surprise a lot of people. And then you have some really good blockers. Will Kazmarek, Bennett Christensen gotten better at that. other guys, Jelani Thurman, I think, has improved in that way. Something Max Clare is going to have to continue to work on. But this is a group that, isn't going to get a lot of the love. And I understand it because of the receivers on this team, because of just the overall weapons that the Buckeyes have. But if there was ever going to be a year of the tight end at Ohio State, this could be it. And, I don't know if we're going to see, a guy like Max Clare or somebody, get close to 50 catches or anything like that, which is what Max Clare caught a year ago, just because of how much this ball is going to get spread around. But there's the opportunity for it. And as Keenan Bailey explained to me when I asked about, we bring in a guy like Max Clare to this room or to this offense that already has all those weapons, like how do you make that work? And he said he actually thinks it makes it easier on those guys because they're going to be open more. If he's at Purdue or at other schools where the tight end is maybe the primary option, you've got to, like Penn State a year ago, you've got to get creative with the way you get the tight end the ball. Maybe not. That was a little, it was effective, but that was a bit much. But you still have to figure out ways, Georgia a couple of years ago with their tight end, I'm blanking on his name, that plays for the Raiders now. That's the focal point of your offense. Like it's a little bit easier to cover those guys. Well, now the focal point of the offense, or at least from a defensive perspective, you got to stop Jeremiah Smith. You got to stop Carnell Tate. You got to be aware of these running backs, right? There's other receivers, the slot receiver. So then all of a sudden you have these skilled tight ends who can make plays in the receiving game as well, while also most of them being effective blockers. That's a pretty good group. And look, it's going to make Brock Bowers, that's his name, the tight end from Georgia. It's going to make life very difficult for defensive coordinators for an offense that was already difficult. And, you talk about new quarterbacks coming in, what's a quarterback's, especially a young and experienced quarterback's best friend? Guys over the middle. And, you saw it, Julian Sayin to Max Clare, Tavian St. Clair to Nate Roberts in the spring game. Like that's an easy outlet for those guys, especially if they're single covered or able to get free because your attention is on those other guys. So I think this is a really interesting group of tight ends that could, by mid-season, end of the season, we're talking about them a lot more than we normally are when we're talking about pieces in the Buckeye offense, or at least pieces that statistically contribute, because the tight ends have been very, very important to this offense. It's just not always what shows up on the stat sheet. Another guy, speaking of weapons on the offense, and cheers. Again, I see some of your questions in the chat. Feel free to keep those going. I'm going to get to a lot of them at the end, unless they pop up while we're talking about something. But love the discussion. Keep it up. This is more fun when we get to talk to you guys than I just talk to myself. But the next one on offense, CJ Donaldson, the running back transfer from West Virginia. This is a guy who I think when he first transferred in, people were pretty interested, but it's not like Quinshon Judkins year ago, an all SEC guy, right? The numbers, over 1,000 yards, both of his first 2 years. CJ Donaldson's numbers aren't that. So maybe that's part of it. And, there is also the excitement about James Peebles, which I think is justified. I think that it is, James Peebles is set up to have a really big year working with CJ Donaldson. But you saw in the spring game, especially early, I think it was that first drive with Julian Sayin, the second drive of the game, he gets out, catches a screen pass. This is a guy who is listed at, what do they have him at? Donaldson. 6'2", 237, showing off hands, making a catch on the screen, talking to running backs coach Carlos Lachlan. He believes he could even line up a little bit as a receiver if needed. It's a guy that can do some different things. Isn't just a big, powerful back that you might think while looking at him. And I just don't know if we're talking enough about what he's going to bring to Ohio State. So the last 2 seasons at West Virginia in the Big 12, 171 carries, 798 yards, 11 touchdowns, 9 catches, 59 yards. That was 2023. 2024, 163 catches, 734 yards, 11 touchdowns, 14 receptions, 104 yards, and another score. So those aren't huge numbers. Now, I also think it's important to point out both of those years, C.J. Donaldson was splitting the workload with other running backs, at least one other running back. And that means he's used to what he's about to walk into in Ohio State's running back room, right? It's not like this will be the first time and there'll be an adjustment. Not that there was for Quinshon Judkins or Travion Henderson last year, but it is just the experience of sharing that and what that's like. Still probably be different, still take some adjustment, but I do think that plays a part. But now imagine you're in this Ohio State offense and what those numbers could look like. And I don't think they're going to be a ton better than what he did the last 2 seasons, just because, again, he's going to share the workload. But he played 12 games in 2023, 13 games in 2024. I mean, if you're Ohio State, you're expected to be in the college football playoff. You hope you're back in the Big Ten championship game. So, if you get into the college football playoff, if you win the Big Ten, there's at least one more game, if not a couple more games, if the Buckeyes can make another run, that C.J. Donaldson could help buoy those numbers there. And then there's the stuff he can do as a power back. I think something, Ohio State, Quinshon Judkins was able to do some of that last year. Will Howard as the quarterback was able to do some of that last year. But when you get in short yardage situations, goal line situations, having a back that is 237 pounds, by comparison, James Peoples is 203 pounds. Bo Jackson, the freshman, 210 pounds. C.J. Donaldson is by far the biggest running back on the team. T.C. Caffey is listed at 215. So if he's healthy, that could be interesting. But I just don't think we've talked enough about C.J. Donaldson and what he could bring to this offense. Now, some of that is we haven't seen a ton of it, right? And even in the spring game, they weren't rotating those guys. It was more James Peoples with the first team, if I remember correctly, and C.J. Donaldson mostly with the second team. But I think that this is a guy who could surprise some people just with the versatility that he has as a big running back, plus his skills, I think make a lot of sense in this offense. Okay, the next one, still staying on the offensive side. I promise we'll get back to defense here in a minute. Can't go a show without talking about quarterbacks, right? But this one specifically is about Lincoln Kienholz. And I think that there was an assumption coming into spring practice by a lot of people, and there's nothing wrong with this, that Lincoln Kienholz, actually, let's go back even further. I think when Lincoln Kienholz committed to Ohio State, after he was initially committed to Washington, the Buckeyes sort of get in on the process a little bit later with Kienholz. He commits on December 14th and then enrolls that next summer. December 14th, 2022. I think there was just kind of assumption that he was a throw-in quarterback, just a guy that, okay, he's interesting, probably never going to start here, but we need a quarterback in this class. He's committed to a Power Force program, was a 4-star prospect, good size, athlete, things like that. And, maybe he never ends up playing. Maybe he transfers. I know there's been talk about him transferring for quite some time. But Lincoln Kienholz has stuck with this program for 2 seasons, despite not even really being mentioned much in the quarterback competition each of those 2 off seasons. One of them, obviously, is coming in to his freshman year, but he's just quietly gotten better and better and better. And this spring, I think he really showed that improvement. And the fact that he's been in this Ohio State offense longer than either of the other 2 quarterbacks on the roster, he understands a lot of this offense just because he's gone through it. Then I think maybe some of the lasting impact of the only time Ohio State fans have seen Lincoln Kienholz was in that Cotton Bowl game that things did not go well. And, I'm not going to rehash how that all went. You remember, but, it's hard, I guess, to get kind of that image out of your minds. And then you bring in a guy like Julian Sayin, right, from the transfer portal last year. And all of a sudden, you have a 5-star guy who you expect to be, the starter going forward. So I think some of that had baked into Lincoln Kienholz coming into this spring without the buzz of other quarterbacks who I think similarly ranked that Ohio State has had in terms of recruiting rankings and things like that. Then you get into spring practice. Lincoln Kienholz at times was the best quarterback out there. Not all the time. We were at the Student Appreciation Day practice. That day, he was definitely the best quarterback on the field for Ohio State. The spring game, it was Julian Sayen's day, no doubt about that. But I did think the way Lincoln Kienholz responded to a 1-for-3 start, a couple of errant throws early on, but bounced back well and finished the day. What was his stat line? He finished the day 12 of 18 for 158 yards and 2 touchdowns against a vanilla defense, no doubt. Ryan Day said that after the game, but I think that's a guy who would start at most Power 5, Power 4 programs, or at least be in the conversation probably quicker than he has been at Ohio State. And if you told me week 1 against Texas, Lincoln Kienholz is your starting quarterback, I don't feel bad about it. He understands the offense, as I mentioned. He's throwing the ball well for the most part. He's got the athleticism of a guy who played multiple sports. So I think that's a guy who could certainly make an impact if needed for Ohio State. Do I expect Julian Sayen is the starter week 1? Yes, I do. But I think we're probably not giving Lincoln Kienholz enough credit for what he's done in terms of staying in the program, not bailing last offseason, for instance, or even this offseason with Julian Sayen and Tavian St. Clair in there. He's worked hard. He's learned the offense. He's improved. And that's what you want from a young quarterback, right? It's great if you have a 5-star guy like a Julian Sayen or a Tavian St. Clair, but a guy who knows what he's doing, knows how to handle things, I think is important for this offense. And look, I think it's important for the way Ryan Day wants to run his program. Being a quarterback guy, you want that path to be available, right? You don't want players to come in and think, oh, they're going to go out and get a Will Howard or a Justin Fields every year. Now, I know Ohio State has when needed to, but you want to see guys stay in the program and succeed. And, we'll see what happens with Lincoln, but I do think he is a guy who that is a story, whether he starts or not this season, that I think is impressive and probably should be touched on a bit more. Another newer guy, and this got brought up in the chat here, so let me pull this up. Well, as I look for it, I will mention him. Logan George, the defensive end who transferred in from Idaho State. The FCS transfers are always interesting ones, right? Because you are jumping up a level to go from here we go. Here's from Emily. He's an edge, but I'm excited to see Logan George play. Yep, I think you should be, and I'll explain why. The jump from the FCS to FBS levels is a lot, right? And not everybody can make that jump. Then you go from not just FCS to FBS, but you go from FCS to Ohio State, and that's its own kind of level, right? So I was interested to see how a Logan George would fare in coming to a place like Ohio State and trying to make that work. Let me say this. I've been impressed. I really have. This is a guy who had, over 50 tackles a year ago. Tackles, I think 11 or so tackles for loss. I don't have his numbers right in front of me. But a very productive player at that level. Could he, in one off season, become an FBS Ohio State level defensive end? I think the answer is becoming pretty clearly yes. I don't know if he's a guy who day one will start. Actually, I would say it's unlikely. I think you've got Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry back, guys that have waited their time and are talented players. So those to me are your guys at defensive ends. But you need depth. You need guys to rotate in there. And I think if you watch the spring game, you saw what the coaches have seen from Logan George all spring was high motor, able to get around the edge. Now, he is with the second string, I think, most of that game, going against what was mostly the second string offensive line. But that is the production you want to see, right? I think I would be concerned if he went out there against the second string offensive line and wasn't able to cause some issues, because he is an experienced player, even if it is at a slightly different level. So, that's a guy who I think can make some noise this season for Ohio State, because he is, as I said, experienced at doing this. It's not like he's a freshman walking in doing this for the first time, but he does have to up his game. And I think you've seen that, if you were able to watch any of spring practice, what you saw in the spring game should make you feel pretty good about what Logan George can do, and give you that third defensive end. Maybe your fourth is CJ Hicks. Maybe it's another guy that emerges. Zion Grady's a guy who had a freshman who had a good offseason, or has had a good offseason. So I think the importance of not only getting a guy like Logan George, but then that guy being able to translate to this level could be big for Ohio State. And I know there were questions about a defensive end transfer portal guy. We'll talk about him at the end of the show. I'll bring up some of those questions, tell you what I know, which I think I have a decently good grasp on that situation. And here's one that I don't think really got talked about much in spring, is Ohio State special teams. And this could be a really veteran group of special teams players. You talk about, I know there was talk after the Michigan game about Jaden Fielding and, the misses he had in that game. I understand the frustration and everything, but he was a player who throughout the season was very good. Finished the year 13 of 17, which, not perfect, but good. Made some big kicks during the playoff. So you have that, a returning starter. This will be his fourth year in the program. You expect some improvement. You have, at least at punter, a veteran at Joe McGuire now, who punted last season for Ohio State. Maybe not quite the big leg you want, but had some important punts, was able to pin teams deep at times. But he's got a year of experience on him. Nick McLarty, who served as the backup punter last year, he'll be in his second season of college football. He was really adjusting from playing Aussie rules football and kind of, figuring out how, has a big leg, but needed to be more consistent, figuring out this game, the American football, and how about all of that. So I think that's a good room. And, maybe Nick McLarty wins the job if he's more consistent this year. Now you have that big leg, or maybe they can use both of them depending on what you need out of the punt. Long snapper, you've got John Furlman returning. He's now going to be, I believe, his fifth year of college football. We talked to him in the spring. Well, we talked to all these guys, but I was just really impressed with him in the spring, talking about, the ways in which he tries to improve. And you think, like, long snapping, if you can do it, you can do it, right? But there's more to it than that. I liked that he felt like he still needed to improve, even though I don't think there were many issues last season with the long snapping. So that right there is a pretty good group. Obviously, the guys that will fill in around, gunners, linemen, the return guys. We don't know who will return punts and kicks yet, but the Ohio State showed last year a better ability at that. Caleb Downs returning the one against Indiana. So I think this could be a very veteran group that, we talk about special teams a lot for the negative reasons for Ohio State, but there could be much more positive things to talk about with special teams because of just how many guys have played in these roles. And look, there's also going to be opportunity for young guys to step in at those other spots and show what they can do. And so you're going to have a nice mix of veterans at some like key positions, punter, kicker, long snapper, and then young guys probably who are hungry and want to show that they have what it takes to play first team offense, first team defense. And I think that's a nice blend and how you can get more success from your special teams unit. So we all want to see that, right? Cheers. All right, here's an interesting one that occurred to me while I was making this list, and that is the lack of talk about Jeremiah Smith. And obviously, he's gotten a lot of publicity. He's going to be one of the faces of college football this season if he's not already. He's going to be mentioned for the Blitnikoff and for the Heisman and all that stuff. But for as good as he was, and like the way that he ended the season with the plays he made during the college football playoff and obviously the big catch at the end of the national championship, I thought this was going to be an offseason where he was just everywhere, opportunities for commercials, interviews, all this stuff. And if you really think about it, like there hasn't been a ton of Jeremiah Smith talk, an appropriate amount, but it hasn't been over the top. And I thought for sure it was going to be over the top. And I think there's credit goes to him and his people for keeping his head on straight and not allowing him to buy into the hype that could have come off of last season and just, hey, let's focus and get better, which is what he's done this offseason. I think credit goes to Ohio State for working with him and managing a still relatively young player the right way. Brian Hartline's talked about, kind of handling him in situations where he's in the middle of, crowds or things like that. Like we saw it at the end of the Student Appreciation Day practice. Like he got mobbed by the students and fans that were there. And I think that, the way that Ohio State let him, kind of have his moment and sign autographs for the fans and take pictures and whatnot, but then got him out of there. So he didn't get stuck there for, an hour and a half or something is admirable and important. I think you could sort of group Carnell Tate in there. Like I thought there would be more Carnell Tate talk as well with the way he finished against Texas and just like, being that next man up. I thought that there would be more buzz about him and, hey, he had a pretty good season as a first-year starter. Was he going to do in year two? So I think this receiver room, which is going to be one of the most talented in the country, but with those two as the faces of it, the returning guys, they have quietly gone about their business, and I think that's a really positive thing this offseason. Not that I would be concerned because it's a Brian Hartline room, but if all of a sudden Jeremiah Smith were showing up on commercials across Columbus. I know he did go out and do the photo shoot. I think he went somewhere. I'm not sure how they do that, but he was part of the photo that's going to be on the NCAA or whatever they're calling the college football video game. So he has done some stuff, and I think he should. That's part of being a superstar, right? As much as he wants to do. But I think the fact that Jeremiah and Carnell, to a lesser extent, have just handled their business and not become these, hype machine stars. You see it a lot with teams after they win championships, especially at the professional level. Maybe we'll start to see it more at the collegiate level now with NIL and everything. But, you have this championship season, and then all of a sudden your players are in demand. Your star players are in demand. And college is a little different because a lot of those guys end up leaving afterwards. But guys that come back, I could see this being a thing in the future. I think about the Kansas State Chiefs and the run that they've been on after that last Super Bowl. You see Patrick Mahomes in all these commercials. You see Travis Kelce in commercials. Guys like that. That could have been what happened to Jeremiah Smith. Not to say that those guys then don't still have the time to go do the things that they need to get better. But you only have so much time in the day, so much attention span, things like that. And I think Ohio State has done a good job of keeping the main thing for these guys, as they say over there. So I think that's impressive. And the last one that I will bring up, and this is that I have a couple more that I put as like maybes if we have time, but this is the last one I certainly wanted to bring up was Fahim Delaney, the safety, the freshman safety. We've talked about this safety position next to Caleb Downs a good amount this spring, but it's Malik Hartford, Jalen McClain, Malik Hartford. And I don't know if Fahim Delane comes in and really gets involved in that conversation this year. But I do think that he has made his case a little bit to be in the mix, or to at least certainly kind of uh, attract some attention, raise your radar on him. The play he made in the spring game was one that still stands out to me. Yes, he's going against Tavian St. Clair in the third team offense, but reads the eyes of St. Clair, a freshman quarterback. Fair enough, but this is also a freshman safety. Reads the eyes, gets in the lane there quickly, closes down, makes the interception. Would have been a pick six if you're playing real football. They stopped that. So, that's a guy who, again, I'm not sure this is the season to break into the safety room or the starting safety spot, but there is an opportunity there. And we assume after next season, there's going to be another spot when Caleb Downs leaves, and you're going to have big shoes to fill there with Caleb Downs departing. So, a guy who's had a good spring and probably, maybe he came on towards the second half of spring and, obviously the spring game, but I thought deserved to be brought up in this conversation of under-discussed storylines coming out of spring practice. And he's an interesting one. He's an interesting one for sure. All right, so that's the list we're going to go with. Let me look through here. I saw some questions, some comments. We'll pull some of those up. If you have anything else you want me to address, if you have any questions, if there's anything else you think has been an under-discussed topic, feel free to throw it in the chat if you're watching this live. Corey Hatcher, who's the next boom, a high school recruit or transfer portal guy? That goes in with a couple questions I saw of the transfer portal defensive end. I want to make sure I don't say the wrong name here because I've been known to do that. Bo Atkinson. All right, that's what I thought. I knew it was Atkinson. I couldn't remember the first name. Bo Atkinson. He's a guy from North Carolina, defensive end, edge, whatever you want to call it. Our transfer portal rankings have him as a 4-star prospect, the number 20 edge, number 149 overall. It would not surprise me. He's visiting Ohio State on Monday, as Bill Kurlick reported earlier today. It would not surprise me at all if that's a guy who commits to Ohio State. I think there's a good fit there, in terms of the character. If you've read some of the stuff Bill's written about him, I think he fits academically. I think he fits with the culture. And he's a talented player. Is he a guy who comes in and supplants either the starters? No, but we're talking about Logan George coming in and giving depth at defensive end. I think this is another guy who could do that. Is CJ Hicks that fourth guy? I asked that question earlier. Maybe. But you're still transitioning him from linebacker to defensive end. Now you have a guy in Bo Atkinson potentially, who could come in, knows the position, could be that fourth defensive end, and then you can see where CJ Hicks sort of fits in there. So I think that gives you even more depth and a talented player. I believe he has 2 years of eligibility remaining. So, a guy who could be a backup for a year and a starter in by next season. So that would be my prediction for the next boom. You never know, though. There could be they're certainly making work with a lot of high school kids. We've seen a lot of success recently. Craig Bowman said, our linebackers and DB core is top-notch, talent all over those two groups. No doubt about that. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find much better in the situation, especially with so many guys leaving. Craig Bowman again. I believe we are the most talented team this year. Just need experience and depth pieces on the D-line. Yeah, I think that's probably it. You've got to find the right guy at safety. I think that's going to be important. Those tackles have to hit, right? If you all of a sudden get into games, especially game against Texas week 1, and your two tackles are getting beat, that's a problem. But that's still a work in progress, though I think it is more settled, as I said earlier. But yeah, you look pretty much else. Obviously the quarterback, you got to hit on that. But I think the talent is there around whoever wins that job, that they should be pretty good. So yeah, I think so. Jermaine Runnels, does Bo Atkins visit this weekend? He's visiting Monday. I think I said that earlier. Emily said, I met Keenan at the Saddle Up event as well. Such a great guy. Keenan is great. I really like Keenan. I really like pretty much all the coaches on this staff. I think Ryan does a great job of hiring the right people that are also talented people. But Keenan's always been great, even when he was working at various positions and they were having him do a little bit of everything. He always made time when you needed him. Anthony Miller said, we need Bo Atkins in the D tackle from Vanderbilt. We get those two. We repeat. I'd have to look at who that is. If you know, feel free to throw that in the chat. The defensive tackle from Vanderbilt. I have honestly not paid a ton of attention. I've followed Bill's coverage of it. Oh, is that the I'm looking here. Yeah, who let me know who you're talking about exactly there. There's just so many guys that go in the transfer portal that until we know that they're interested or vice versa, if I was trying to follow every single guy that went in there, plus everything else we have to do, it's just a lot, let me tell you. Let's see what we got here. Jackson Johnson with good stat. I didn't check this, so if this is wrong, this is on Jackson, but I'm going to trust him here. We are only 134 days away from the start of the 2025 Ohio State season. That's crazy. I guess that number sounds right, but this just it always goes so fast, and it's good to enjoy the off season, but we always are excited for football to get here, right? Bryce Shump says, is Haynes or Marshall the starter for Michigan? Not going to pretend to know everything about what's going on at Michigan right now. I was impressed with Marshall the end of last season. He's a guy Ohio State obviously recruited pretty heavily. So I would lean that way, but they're both good players, no doubt about it. I just really liked Marshall, but I am no Michigan reporter. So I do want to, throughout the offseason, have guys on from other outlets in the 247 network that Ohio State's playing. So we will have our Michigan guys on, and we'll be able to ask some of that. Lisa Sims says, Michigan spring games tomorrow, and I can't wait to see what the Michigan people talk about. Yeah, that's probably one I won't watch live, but I may record it just to watch after the fact. Spring games, even Ohio State's last weekend, good for people that are really paying attention to stuff. But if they were actually going through games, I don't know what Michigan is doing, but not something that I used to watch so many of them, and I just don't anymore. Rick Montoya, Max Clare's a dog and will give defenses nightmares. Yeah, I think so. He has to continue to improve as a blocker, I think. But I think that he is something different for the Ohio State offense. Charles Parks, Hartford doesn't impress me playing safety. I wonder why. If you're still watching, what about him? I think he was probably thrown in there a little earlier than he should have been during his freshman season. But from what I've seen, I think he and Jalen McClain have both looked pretty good. So I'm curious why you think that. Billy Tuesday, curious why we've heard so little about Demarion Witten. I actually wrote about Demarion Witten earlier this offseason. Pretty good story, I think. Not to toot my own horn, but really like the interview I had with him, he was really good. So I think it made for a good story. If you want to find that, it's out there. But I think for the most part, you are looking at a guy who came in as a tight end or expected to play tight end, made the transition to the wide receiver room during last season, and it's a deep and talented room. And this is a guy that has to continue to develop. So I don't think you have to be worried necessarily about him. I just think it's going to take some time. Let's see. Quincy Porter, that's Rick Montoya. Quincy Porter will get plenty of playing time this year. I think if it were anywhere else, yes. I just not worry. I don't know how you fit him in to, he's an outside receiver. So you've got Jeremiah Smith, you've got Carnell Tate as your starters. Brian Hartline hasn't rotated a lot these last few years, going with the main guys. Mylan Graham can play on the outside. You've still got Brandon Innes, and maybe this should have been one of the things we talked about. Bryson Rogers started the spring game. Yeah, are we not talking about Bryson Rogers enough? So I like Quincy Porter a lot. I just don't know how he fits this season. But I think this is a guy who's willing to continue to put in the work and be a player for the future for sure. All right, let's see what else we got. Jermaine Runnels. Are we overlooking Mylan Graham? Again, same thing. Maybe, but I just don't know. He's not a freshman. He's a redshirt freshman, but he came in last summer. He hasn't even been in the Ohio State program for a year. Again, where does he fit? In some games, I think those guys can definitely get some playing time, and they should. But where does he fit in big games? Who are you taking out to put Mylan Graham on the field? I think he's really talented. I think he's really exciting. You saw it in the spring game. There's some really good plays there. But you also have really good, really talented players ahead of him on the depth chart already who have some more experience. So I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying there's not a clear path that's like, oh yeah, he can come and step into that. And maybe that's part of your question, right? Are we overlooking him? Well, maybe we should be talking about him more, but they've got these other guys there. Anthony Miller, the entire secondary is going to be amazing, but I'm slightly worried about Styles and Hartford. I'd rather see Bryce West at nickel and McLean or Roker at strong safety. That's fair. I think that nickel spot is certainly still up for grabs. I talked about it on the last happy hour that, how important that is. And I think it's still, Lorenzo Styles obviously has some playing time there, but there's a lot of guys in that cornerback room. Jermaine Matthews has played some in the slot this spring and, has moved. We saw it in practice at times, moved from the slot on one play to the outside on the other play and didn't look like he had any issues. So that's another option. The safety spot is still very much up in the air, I think. I think you've got some talent there. I don't know what I don't know why people don't like Hartford. I thought he's been good other than when he was maybe thrown into the fire a little bit too early. Emily, we never give our quarterbacks credit. We pick one, and that's the only one that exists. It's sad. Well, not in 2014, right? There were three then. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's Anthony Miller. Satan's only weaknesses are his height and quiet personality. He'll get more vocal, and the staff is working hard to lift his release point. So I wrote about the Julian Sayin height thing this week and got a lot of backlash on it. And even though the story was about the fact that the height shouldn't be an issue. So he's listed 6'1" on Ohio State's roster. I think you could argue he's, I know Dave Biddle said he thinks he's 6'2". I would have guessed closer to 6 foot, 5'11", just standing next to him. I'm not a tall guy at all. But he just, he's definitely not as tall as recent Ohio State quarterbacks, most of whom have been 6'3". Will Howard was 6'4". Lincoln Kienholz, I believe, is listed 6'3". I think Tavian St. Clair 6'4". So when he's with the other quarterbacks, or when he was with Will Howard and Devin Brown last year, there was a noticeable difference in height. Now, is that the end all be all? No. Would you prefer to have a 6'3" guy? Yes. You can see the way Ryan Day recruits them. You'd like to have a 6'3" guy at that position for obvious reasons. You got to be able to see over the offensive line. It changes sort of your throwing lanes a little bit, but there are plenty of shorter quarterbacks, not short quarterbacks that have had success in college football, certainly, and have had success in the NFL. You probably know the list. Again, I wrote about this earlier this week, so you can go read them. But Drew Brees, Russell Wilson, Kyler Murray, Tua, Bryce Young was the one I was thinking of from Alabama. So there's a lot of guys that have been shorter and have had success. And I think it's funny with the Ohio State quarterback situation because I remember back when JT Barrett was the starter, and specifically right around right after that 31-0 Clemson game. Ohio State fans, we need a pocket passer. We need a guy who can make all the throws, this and that, and this and that. And I completely got it because that wasn't JT Barrett. He was a dual threat guy, right? And he, had some limitations. Okay, so then you go to Dwayne Haskins, and then the conversation quickly became, would he run? Would he ever run? Could he run? And he did like once or twice, like the Maryland game comes to mind late in that game. But like, oh, we've lost that dual threat. And then you get Justin Fields, who is probably the best of both worlds situation for Ohio State. Great arm, could run, was really good athlete. But then CJ Stroud doesn't run. Well, we need a guy who can pull the ball sometimes. And, where is this with CJ? Why is he not running? And he got super defensive. And then, you go from him to Kyle McCord, who hardly ran, and people want a guy who can run. Will Howard was a nice blend, though they didn't use it a ton. So like tall pocket passer or shorter dual threat guy. And I feel like often Ohio State fans, unless it ends with the national championship like it did with Will Howard, there's often a lot of conversation about the other side of things. And look, Julian Sayin is uber talented. No doubt about that. Would he be even better if he were 6'3"? I don't know. I think it would certainly help some things. But the Ohio State coaches don't seem to be all that concerned about it. So I'm not going to be concerned about it. But I did write about it, and I felt like I got yelled at because I was perpetuating the narrative when I was actually trying to help the narrative. Jermaine Runnels, why is Larry Johnson Sr. hate starting up again? I haven't seen a lot of that. I think, as the recruiting, we get into offseason and recruiting stuff, people obviously want to see the Buckeyes land top defensive linemen. That hasn't quite happened yet, but I think, he continues to do his thing. And I've never understood, the Larry Johnson stuff. Has there been times when it's like, is it time to move on? I think people have made that argument, but he keeps producing. Ohio State just won a national championship with very productive defensive lines. So, I think that says a lot. All right, let's see if we've got any more questions here. And Jamie King, we should average 40 points a game. They could. It'll be interesting to see the start against Texas. No doubt about that, what it looks like. But the offense has a ton of talent. No doubt about it. Anthony Miller said, I think after the 2 interceptions in the spring game, St. Clair looked like a generational talent. Hopefully he gets reps like Arch Manning got as a backup 2 years ago. Kid is special. I think there's a lot to like. Yeah, the 2 interceptions weren't great. But like I said, with Lincoln Kienholz, he settled into the game really well. Pull that up again. Finished the game. And these are all unofficial statistics because Ohio State, for some reason, didn't want to have official statistics for the spring game. 11 of 15. 116 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. He also ran for 16 yards. I think sacks. There were some sacks in there. I think, once you got past the 2 interceptions, I thought Tavian looked really good. I don't know how much he's going to get playing time this season. Whether it looks at all like what Arch did a couple of years ago. Remember, there's still Lincoln Kienholz and Julian Sayin, whoever doesn't win the job, on the roster too. So Anthony Miller says Zion Grady is a future star. Certainly has looked like it. Let's see. Anthony Miller, Hartford is a little hesitant times. When he plays free, he's amazing. All right. All right. Yep. So Will Star says, Patrick, I think it was because you said Sayin was closer to 5'10" than 6'1". Yeah, that was a joke that didn't go over, that didn't catch well on the message boards. But also, I will be interested to see. I think Ohio State usually does a really good job with, first of all, the people were already yelling at me before I made that joke. But I think Ohio State usually does a pretty good job with heights and weights. when you compare it to like the NFL Combine, which is as accurate as you're going to get. I would not be surprised if Julian Saint ends up being a little bit shorter than what he's listed as. I just standing next to him, and I have some friends that are 6'1". I think he's probably a little shorter than that, or could be. It wouldn't surprise me if he was. But again, I don't think it's going to make a huge deal. So we shall see. All right. Anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. I didn't think this show would go an hour, but again, the conversation and stuff here at the end, I love doing that. So please, every episode, let's fill those comments. Oh, here's a good one from Taco. Will OSU use the tight end position like the 49ers do? Not sure about that. I don't know if they've got that type of guy, but they certainly have options. But I like that question. That's interesting. Maybe I'll point Keenan Bailey in that direction next time I see him. No, I'm sure Keenan is well aware of what the 49ers do. Anyway, thank you guys for doing this. Again, if you are watching this on YouTube, please hit the like button, turn on the alarm, know when we get all our videos. If you're on any other things, follow, like, subscribe, all that. And if you're listening to this podcast, 5-star review, give us a like. Those things are all really important to help continuing to grow this channel, which has been really good for us the past several years. Also, good time of year to join Bucknuts if you are not already. A lot of transfer portal talk going on the site. There's going to be recruiting coverage. We're going to get into June with the camps in the not-so-distant future. So good time to become a member if you are not already. Anyway, thank you, Buckeye fans. We'll talk to you soon, probably next week, I imagine. Cheers.